All right, let's jump right in. Back to Jane Austen we go, but this time we're really digging into Pride and Prejudice, chapters 56 through 61.
Oh, things get interesting.
For sure, big time. And we've got excerpts focusing on, well, Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy.
Of course.
And how could we forget Lady Catherine de Bourgh?
She's quite a character.
Oh, absolutely. She really shakes things up at Longbourn. It's not just a visit, it's an arrival.
You could say that
Chaise and 4 horses.
it's a statement, isn't it?
Yeah. Even before she says a word, it's like Austen is using this big, grand entrance to show us, like, Lady Catherine's personality.
She's not exactly subtle.
No, not at all. So, like, she's all about social superiority. You can just tell.
Exactly. And right away you see that difference, right? Her world and the Bennet's world.
Totally different.
Lady Catherine, she's like the top of the social ladder. English society, very rigid. And the Bennets, well, they're genteel, but...
Not quite on her level.
And that clash, well, that's where we see the big themes Austen's exploring.
Okay, so themes. Where do we even begin?
Well, I mean, the title kind of gives it away, right? Pride and Prejudice.
Makes sense?
Woven through the whole story, not just romance, but how people see each other, how they judge
Based on what?
social standing, family, even like perceived morals.
Oh, for sure. And Lady Catherine, she's like the poster child for pride.
Absolutely. Her lineage, her status, it controls everything she does.
Especially with Elizabeth. The idea of Darcy marrying someone, not from her world.
Unthinkable.
Yeah, scandalous. And Elizabeth, she's facing prejudice from the start.
Always judged.
Family's money or lack of it, their, sometimes their behavior.
Not always the most polished.
And their connections, or the lack of them. Even Darcy, he gets caught up in that at first.
He lets his own ideas, his prejudices, blind him to who Elizabeth really is.
It's interesting, right? Elizabeth and Darcy, they both have to deal with these things, these flaws.
Pride and Prejudice.
Right, to really see each other. And then, well, love.
It's a journey for them both, unlearning what society tells them, seeing the person, not the
label.
Exactly. So Pride and Prejudice, big theme. What else are you noticing?
Well, it's all tied together, right? Pride, prejudice, and then society, class.
Austen was so good at showing how that worked in 19th century England.
Oh, yeah. Not just money, though.
So much more.
Like who your family was, who you knew, these rules, unspoken, but everyone knew them.
Absolutely. Like how you could marry, how to act in public. It was everything.
Oh, totally. And you see it with Mr. Collins, the way he acts around Lady Catherine. It's like
desperate to impress her.
Name-dropping like crazy.
Social climbing at its finest.
Yeah. But it does show us how important that all was back then.
Your whole future could depend on it?
Absolutely. Not just pride, it's like survival.
And then you've got Charlotte Lucas marrying Mr. Collins, not for love.
A practical decision.
Financial security. For women back then, marriage, it wasn't always about romance.
Sometimes it was about, staying afloat.
Exactly. And Austen, she's showing us all these different reasons for getting married. Lydia, impulsive, runs off with Wickham.
Oh, it was a mesh.
Passion, no thought for the consequences.
And then Jane and Bingley, they're the
real deal.
But even they have trouble with families interfering, society getting in the way.
It's like Austen is saying, look, here are your choices, and here's what can happen. It's all within this system, this social structure.
So rigid.
And she makes you think, right? Is she saying, through Elizabeth, that real happiness, it comes from finding someone who loves you for you, not for your family, your money?
It's a pretty radical idea for that time.
It goes against everything that society is built on. And speaking of Elizabeth, let's talk about her. What makes her such a great character? The one we're rooting for.
Oh, she's amazing. So smart, so witty. And she's independent. She doesn't just follow the rules.
She sees through the BS.
Yeah, all the hypocrisy. And she doesn't let society or anyone tell her what to do, not even Lady Catherine.
She stands up for herself.
Oh, yeah. And she's funny. The way she talks about everyone, it's hilarious.
But it's smart humor, too.
Right. She sees people for who they really are.
Not just the surface stuff.
And that's what makes her and Darcy so interesting together. They're both so, sharp.
It's a battle of wits.
Oh, totally. And they clash because they misunderstand each other.
Society's expectations, their own prejudices.
Takes them a while to figure it out.
And this is where Austen is so clever with her writing. She uses free, indirect discourse.
What's that?
It's like we're in Elizabeth's head. We know her thoughts, her doubts, even when she doesn't say them out loud.
Oh, that's cool.
It makes us feel for her. Even when she makes mistakes, we get why she does what she does.
It's like we're on her side, even when she's being stubborn.
Exactly. And it's funny, right? Pride and Prejudice, they're not just themes. They're the things keeping Elizabeth and Darcy apart.
That's true.
Like Austen is saying, these are human flaws, but they stop us from seeing the good in others, from finding happiness.
So we've covered a lot. Pride, prejudice, society, class, and we've started to see how complex Elizabeth is.
He's a fascinating character.
But what about Darcy? He's still a bit of a mystery, isn't he?
He is. At first, he seems so proud, so distant. Like the typical, wealthy, entitled gentleman.
But there are hints, right, that he's not what he seems.
We talked about those contradictions. His actions, his words, they don't always match up.
It's like he's fighting with himself, like what he's supposed to be versus who he really is.
And one of the big moments where we see this is when he helps Lydia.
Remind me, what happened with Lydia again? All the Bennet sisters, I get them mixed up.
Right, so Lydia, the youngest, impulsive, flirty, she runs off with Wickham. The soldier, charming, but not a good guy.
Oh, yeah. Big scandal.
Huge. Could ruin the family. No one will want to marry the other sisters.
Disaster. And Elizabeth is horrified. But where does Darcy come in?
This is the interesting part. Darcy, he doesn't like the Bennets, right? His relationship with Elizabeth, well, it's complicated. But he secretly fixes the whole thing. Finds Wickham and Lydia, pays Wickham to marry her.
Really? Wow. That's incredibly generous, especially after how Wickham treated him.
It doesn't seem like him, does it? The proud, judgmental Darcy?
Not at all. So what's going on there? Why would he do that?
This is what Elizabeth struggles with. It makes her rethink everything she thought she knew about Darcy.
Maybe she was wrong about him.
Maybe her own pride, her own prejudices were clouding her judgment.
It's a big moment for both of them, a turning point.
It opens the door for a real connection, based on respect, on understanding.
Okay, that makes sense. So what happens next? So Darcy steps in, saves the day. It's a big turning point, right?
Huge. It really shows us who he is deep down.
Not the guy we thought he was.
Exactly. He's capable of compassion, of putting others first.
Even the Bennets. Even after, well, everything.
He's not just thinking about himself. He's acting selflessly.
And that's not the Darcy we met at the beginning, the one at the ball.
It makes you wonder what's changed.
What made him do it? I mean, it had to be more than just duty, right?
That's the question Elizabeth asks herself. And it changes how she sees him.
She realizes she was wrong.
She starts to see that her own judgments, her pride, maybe they were blinding her.
Wow, that's a powerful realization. So what happens then?
Well, Darcy, he sees how grateful Elizabeth is, and he takes a chance.
He proposes again.
He does, but this time it's different. It's not about society. It's not about duty.
It's about love.
It's about recognizing that connection, that pull they have towards each other.
And Elizabeth, she finally sees him for who he is, not who she thought he was.
And she says yes.
So they're getting married. Happy ending, right?
Well, Austen wouldn't make it that easy, would she? There's still family to deal with, society, and their own, well, doubts.
It's not all smooth sailing.
They have to figure out how to be together, how to fit into each other's worlds. It's not simple.
And everyone has an opinion, right?
Of course. Especially about Elizabeth, the new Mrs. Darcy. Imagine the gossip.
I bet Mrs. Phillips had a field day.
Oh, absolutely. And the Lucases always trying to climb that social ladder.
It's like no matter how much you love someone, you can't escape the social pressure.
Austen reminds us of that. But even with those challenges, we see that Elizabeth and Darcy, they find happiness.
They make it work.
They do. They understand each other. They respect each other. They can be themselves together.
It's like they create their own little world away from all the noise.
And their happiness, it spreads, It affects others, especially in the Bennet family.
Oh, right. Like Kitty. She always seemed kind of lost, especially with Lydia being so, well, Lydia.
Right. But without Lydia around and with Elizabeth as a role model, Kitty starts to grow up.
She becomes more mature.
She does. Spends more time with Jane and Elizabeth, learns from them. And she finds her own way.
It's like a good example can really make a difference.
It can. And even Lydia and Wickham, as much as they are who they are, they get help from Darcy.
He helps them.
Financially. Make sure they're okay, even though, let's be honest, they don't deserve it.
That's big of him. Very forgiving.
It shows how much he's changed. He doesn't hold on to anger. He lets go.
He's chosen happiness.
And then there's Lady Catherine. She finally visits Pemberley.
She does, after all that.
She does. It's like a silent admission that she was wrong.
Accepting defeat.
In a way, she can't deny their happiness, even if it means swallowing her pride.
It's like she has to see it for herself. And it brings us back to that theme, right? Humility.
Exactly. Both Elizabeth and Darcy, they had to look at themselves, their flaws, to really find happiness.
So it's not just a love story. It's about growth, about change.
It's about understanding yourself and others, overcoming those barriers we build up.
And it makes you think, are we ever really free from pride and prejudice?
It's a question Austen leaves us with. Are we judging others too quickly? Holding on to beliefs that might be wrong?
It's something to think about, for sure.
It is. And maybe, like Elizabeth and Darcy, we can all learn to be a little more open, a little more forgiving.
It's a good lesson to take away from this deep dive. And speaking of wrapping things up, we still have those final chapters to discuss. What happens after Lady Catherine's visit? Do Elizabeth and Darcy finally get their happily ever after? All right, so final chapters. Lady Catherine's made her visit. What happens now? Do Elizabeth and Darcy, do they actually get their happy ending?
It wouldn't be Austen if it were that simple.
Right, there's got to be more.
There's always another layer.
So what happens? What challenges do they face?
Well, they do find happiness, but Austen shows us it's not always easy. They're from different worlds.
They have to figure out how to, merge those worlds together.
Exactly. And society doesn't just disappear. There are still expectations.
I bet people talked. A lot.
Oh, for sure. Imagine being Elizabeth, now Mrs. Darcy. All eyes on her.
I'd be terrified.
Especially with people like Mrs. Phillips around.
Oh, she must have been a nightmare.
Gossiping, comparing. And the Lucases always trying to, climb that social ladder.
Using Elizabeth's new status.
It's like Austen saying, even when you find love, those social pressures, they're still there.
You can't escape them.
But Elizabeth and Darcy, they manage. They find joy in each other, in their connection.
Their wit, their intelligence, it brings them together.
They can be themselves with each other, away from the judgment, the expectations.
That's really beautiful. It's like they create their own world.
They do, and it's not just them. Their happiness, it affects others too. Like Kitty, for example.
Oh yeah, Kitty, Lydia's younger sister.
Lydia was such a bad influence. But now, with Elizabeth as a role model,
someone to look up to.
Kitty starts to mature. She spends time with Jane and Elizabeth, and she blossoms.
Finds her own way.
And even Lydia and William, they don't really change, but...
They're still them.
But Darcy, he still helps them financially. Makes sure they're okay.
Wow, that's really kind of him after everything they put him through.
It shows his character. He's learned to forgive, to let go.
To move on. It's a powerful message, isn't it? Letting go of anger, choosing happiness.
It is. And something I always loved is how, after all that, Lady Catherine actually visits Pemberley.
No way. She goes to their home.
She does. It's subtle, but it's like she's acknowledging she was wrong.
Accepting defeat.
Maybe. But she sees their happiness, and it's like even she can't deny it.
That's amazing. It really highlights how much Elizabeth and Darcy have grown.
They had to change to overcome their own flaws to get to this point.
And it brings us back to those big themes, right? Pride, prejudice, humility.
We all have to face those things to really understand ourselves, to find true happiness.
And that's what makes Pride and Prejudice so powerful. It's not just a love story. It's about, life.
The challenges we face, the choices we make, it's timeless, really.
Austen's writing, it resonates even now.
And her characters, they feel so real. You can relate to them, even centuries later.
It makes you think, are we really that different from the people in the book?
Do we make the same mistakes? Let pride get in the way? Judge others too quickly?
These are questions we all have to ask ourselves.
And maybe, like Elizabeth and Darcy, we can learn to be a little better, a little more understanding.
So as we finish this deep dive, I hope everyone listening will take that with them.
Remember to look beyond first impressions, to question your own judgments.
To find your own happily ever after, whatever that looks like for you. Until next time.